I was at a friend's house for dinner the other night, and this woman I just met was describing her new boyfriend. She was just absolutely lit up, glowing, talking about how he was her other half, and they were just meant to be. He was sweet in that really intense new relationship kind of way. But then someone asked her what made it so perfect, and she got this very serious, profound look on her face, leaned in like she was sharing a secret, and said, it's effortless. We don't even have to try, and we've never had a real fight. And I just watched as half the table, the people who've been married a decade, the ones who've been through a messy divorce, they all did that same polite, tight-lipped smile. That little nod you give when you know someone is mistaking the starting line for the finish line, that one comment. Effortless. It's the kind of thing that sounds amazing in a movie, but in reality, it's the emotional equivalent of fast food. And it got me thinking, why are we so obsessed with these garbage-tiered delusional relationship mantras, the ones that sound deep on an Instagram post, but are actually just recipes for resentment and, emotional constipation?
That phrase, never had a real fight, it's one of the biggest red flags you can wave, and you absolutely nailed the core problem. We're confusing the superficial harmony of a new connection with the genuine resilience you need for a long-term partnership. These slogans, they sound aspirational, but they're fundamentally anti-skill. So today, our mission is really to peel back the psychology and the sociology behind these cliches like effortless and conflict-free and investigate what actually builds those long-term resilient bonds. We're moving past the wishful thinking and digging into the complex work required.
Okay, let's unpack this first major lie then. The idea that if a relationship is true, you'll never fight. The cultural premise here suggests that disagreement equals a flaw, right? A failure in the relationship's fundamental compatibility. But the evidence suggests the exact opposite is true. Conflict, when you handle it maturely and constructively, is actually what builds trust because it provides safety in disagreement. It shows your bond can handle reality, not just the fantasy.
And what's fascinating about that desire for peace is how often it's just manufactured through conflict avoidance, or what researchers sometimes call complaint avoidance. The issues don't just disappear, they just get filed away. And filing issues away it's a very short-term strategy to preserve that superficial harmony.
So tell us about how that plays out. You mentioned a story about a couple, Mark and Sarah.
Mark and Sarah are a perfect example. For years, they were that couple everyone admired. They proudly say they never fought. But when they eventually hit a wall, they realized their peace was actually a deep-seated fear. Sarah was constantly walking on eggshells, biting her tongue over everything from chores to, major life decisions. She was just silently accumulating resentment because she felt unheard before she even spoke. And meanwhile, Mark was perpetually anxious. He could sense her mood shifts but couldn't decode them, so he was constantly trying to just manage the situation to keep things calm. Their peace was a delusion. It was built on mutual anxiety. They only achieved a real honest connection when they realized how toxic that avoidance was and started having constructive arguments. They gave each other permission to actually disagree.
So the avoidance keeps things smooth on the surface, but it's actually corrosive long-term. It leads to lower relationship satisfaction.
Precisely. And the data shows this corrosive effect hits the avoiding partner hardest. The adverse impact of conflict avoidance is particularly significant for women, who are statistically more likely to experience dissatisfaction when, high avoidance behaviors are present. But the good news is that research suggests when confrontation does happen, couples tend to benefit greatly because they're finally forcing these latent problems out into the light.
But like you said, the type of confrontation matters a lot. It can't just be a screaming match. So what makes an argument constructive?
It's about tailoring the approach to the problem. So if you're dealing with a severe, changeable problem, something foundational like, say, fidelity or substance abuse, direct confrontation is shown to be most beneficial. It requires clarity, honesty, a clear path forward. However, for minor issues, or maybe for those where change is really difficult, confrontation that involves affection and validation is often much more effective. So that might mean saying, I understand why this bothers you and I love you, but this is a deep habit I'm working on, rather than just immediately jumping to defense.
That sounds like it requires a specific set of emotional resources, though, doesn't it? The ability to approach a problem constructively seems tied to some kind of internal resilience.
It absolutely is. This skill relies greatly on a concept that we call mastery. Mastery, in this context, is the sense of control an individual feels over their life circumstances. Someone with high mastery doesn't feel like a victim of their problems. They feel equipped to solve them.
So it's the belief that you can actually influence the outcome, rather than just being tossed around by what happens.
Exactly. Individuals with higher mastery are much more likely to use constructive conflict management because they feel they have the internal resources and the external capacity to actively seek solutions. And this psychological resource is incredibly robust. It's longitudinally linked to fewer depressive symptoms over decades. It protects your well-being, and it creates this beautiful reciprocal effect in the relationship. When one spouse uses constructive conflict behaviors, the partner is also likely to respond in kind. You start creating positive interactions, turning a potentially volatile moment into a shared problem-solving session.
That sets us up perfectly for the next great myth, the effortless myth. Because if conflict is necessary, then by definition, so is the mental work required to resolve it. And here's where we get into that hidden cognitive cost of relationship maintenance.
This is where we introduce a concept that's distinct from simple emotional labor. It's called hermeneutic labor. Hermeneutic just refers to the work of interpretation, and this labor involves complex, deep cognitive processes, reflection, synthesis, and it's exhausting.
Can you break down what those interpretive burdens look like, day to day?
There are three primary burdens, and they're constantly interacting. First, you have the burden of understanding and coherently expressing your own feelings and desires. That takes real reflection. Second, you have to discern the feelings and desires of others, often when they're being avoidant or, minimally communicative. You're trying to read the emotional room, deciphering silence. And finally, the third burden is comparing these two different sets of feelings to invent solutions or compromises that satisfy both people. It's like being the sole translator for two people who speak completely different languages, except you also have to translate one of those languages to itself first.
Wow. That sounds like a full-time, invisible job.
Oh.
And the sources show there's a serious gendered asymmetry in who typically performs this labor, especially in heterosexual partnerships.
It disproportionately falls on women who are socially cast as the relationship maintenance experts. They're expected to be the emotional managers, the interpreters. And what makes this so exploitative isn't just that it's work, but how it's framed. Society often dismisses this sophisticated cognitive labor as just women's intuition. By calling it intuition instead of skill, it makes the work seem natural, effortless, and therefore, undeserving of recognition or reciprocation. It allows the labor to be invisibly extracted.
And that system is reinforced by the partner who isn't doing the work.
Precisely. And that lack of emotional expressivity reinforces the power dynamic. We see a concept described as normative male alexithymia. Alexithymia literally means no words for feelings. It's a widespread sort of subclinical condition where men, because of socialization, are actively discouraged from finding words for their emotions. They're taught to be stoic, which leaves them deficient in emotional processing.
So the woman's trying to translate a partner who genuinely lacks the vocabulary and the internal map to communicate his own emotional state. She's trying to translate silence.
That's the perfect analogy. His lack of expressivity, whether it's accidental or intentional, forces his partner to perform dramatically more hermeneutic labor just to interpret that silence. And this dynamic sets the stage for one of the most common and destructive communication patterns we see.
The dreaded feedback loop.
The female demand, male withdraw pattern. The demanding partner, usually the woman who has already performed hours of this unpaid interpretive work, finally reaches a breaking point and demands a conversation, and she is immediately viewed by the withdrawing partner as being needy or nagging. The withdrawing partner, typically the man, often maintains power by controlling the terms of the conversation through silence or avoidance. They make the demander feel punished for even trying to seek a resolution, and that dynamic leads to incredibly high dissatisfaction for the demanding partner.
And these patterns feed into these really destructive codependent narratives that promise stability but just deliver sacrifice. We read about the story of Anna, who internalized the motto, happy wife, happy life.
Anna's story is heartbreaking because it shows the long-term costs. She genuinely believed her job was to manage the emotional climate of the home, which meant she performed all the hermeneutic labor, all the proactive conflict resolution, all the interpretive work. She prioritized his comfort and his career above her own ambitions, believing her happiness was just a derivative of his. And eventually, she realized that by making herself the primary emotional support system, she had basically relegated herself to being a supporting character in her partner's life. Her own self-actualization had been sacrificed to maintain this unequal structure.
So these traditional gender roles, where one partner is the worker and one is the emotional manager, they're just incredibly detrimental to individual growth.
They foster an unsustainable codependency where one person is doing all the emotional heavy lifting until they inevitably burn out, or they realize their entire identity has been compromised.
Okay, let's pivot and tackle the final myth, the idea that love is all you need. What happens when the rubber hits the road, specifically around fundamentally different core values that require constant, well, maintenance?
Love is essential, of course, but it's the engine, not the chassis. It can't compensate for a lack of foundational alignment. Think about the classic example of the couple who had deep affection but failed miserably because of fundamentally different financial values, the spender versus the saver.
No, we've all seen that dynamic play out.
Their genuine love was just overwhelmed by the panic the saver felt every single time the spender made an impulsive purchase. It wasn't about being poor, it was about trust and predictability and having a shared vision of the future. The spender's actions repeatedly violated the saver's deepest security value.
So the fight isn't actually about the specific purchase. It's about the erosion of commitment to a shared future. And research backs this up, that financial conflict is not just about having a low income.
That's critical. Research finds financial conflict is a complex marital phenomenon that often stems from deeper issues. While it is associated with economic pressure, it's deeply intertwined with overall relationship quality. A fight about money is often a symptom of hidden problems. Communication failures, lack of respect, fairness issues, unequal economic power. The money conflict becomes the proxy for all the relationship issues they can't face directly.
So if love isn't the magic cure for these structural issues, we need a better, more realistic framework. And that brings us back to something more rational. Social exchange theory.
Absolutely. Social exchange theory views relationships through a lens of rational choice, almost like a continuous cost-benefit analysis. The worth of a relationship is basically conceptualized as worth rewards costs. Individuals are constantly evaluating the partnership, and if the costs consistently outweigh the rewards, especially if all that hermeneutic labor is unreciprocated, the relationship is predicted to terminate.
And the interesting part is how different people measure those rewards and costs.
Right.
It's not a universal scale.
Exactly. We use two internal personal standards. The first is the comparison level, or CL. That's what we feel we should receive based on our past relationships, cultural norms, family models. This establishes our personal standard of satisfaction. If your relationship rewards are below your CL, you're dissatisfied.
So if my CL is high because my parents had a really equitable relationship, I'll be dissatisfied faster than someone whose CL is low.
Correct. The second crucial standard is the comparison level for alternative, or CULT. This is the lowest level of rewards a person is willing to accept, given the other options available. That could be other partners, or just the value of being alone. The CULT provides the measure of stability. A person might be dissatisfied, so their rewards are below their CL, but still stay if the alternative options are even worse.
So the goal isn't to stay because love is magical or because it's effortless. The goal is to define an interdependent relationship where both people supply the wants of the other at a lower cost to themselves than the value they receive.
That strategic mutual interdependence and the benefit both parties receive is what actually defines long-term sustainability. The relationship mantras we criticize, they mistake the starting line, that initial chemistry and ease for the finish line. Real, healthy relationships require complex, well-honed skills, like mastery in coping, constructive conflict resolution, and the equitable distribution of all this emotional and interpretive work.
And circling back to the danger of these delusions, the research we've looked at shows that women often experience this profound dissatisfaction and disempowerment because they are obliged to perform extensive, unreciprocated hermeneutic labor. It just depletes their energy and their self-worth.
That structural configuration where women are obliged to offer these feminine-coded services and interpretive work to men who are socially conditioned to lack emotional literacy is described by some scholarship as a feature of misogyny operating within the social environment. It's a systemic exploitation of emotional labor that punishes emotional clarity and rewards avoidance and withdrawal.
Which means this deep dive really shows us that true intimacy isn't built on some impossible, effortless dream. It's built on the capacity for both partners to show up, be accountable, and consistently do the messy, difficult, unglamorous work of interpretation, resolution, and growth.